step into the remarkable tale of Jane Seymour, the quietly determined woman who rose from a modest upbringing in Wiltshire's Wolfhall to become one of England's most pivotal queens. Though little was expected of her early on, lacking the refined education of highborn nobles, and overshadowed by the famed King Henry VIII's tumultuous court, Jane forged a path that would alter the kingdom's destiny. Gentle in demeanor, but quietly resolute, she navigated the complex intrigues of a monarchy in religious and political upheaval, eventually capturing the king's attention at a moment when his patience had worn thin. Though her time on the throne lasted a mere 17 months, she managed to achieve what her predecessors could not, delivering Henry the male heir he so desperately craved. Yet her triumph soon turned tragic, ending in a death that cemented her place in the royal imagination. Join us as we explore the captivating life of Jane Seymour, a study in understated power, sacrifice, and the remarkable ways a single individual can shape history. Jane Seymour's story begins in the quiet, rolling countryside of Wiltshire at a place called Wolfhall. This estate, surrounded by woodland and gentle hills, was far from the glittering pomp of royal courts. Yet from these modest origins, where her parents, Sir John Seymour and Lady Marjorie Wentworth, lived a reasonably comfortable but unremarkable life, Jane would one day rise to become a central figure in the ever-dramatic saga of King Henry VIII and the English Reformation. Her trajectory would be shaped by a blend of familial ambition, courtly intrigue, and a disposition that many contemporaries described as gentle on the surface, but possessed of a patient, quietly resolute core underneath. In her earliest years, no one could have suspected that this young girl, who enjoyed modest status and minimal academic training, would influence the monarchy so deeply and then exit the stage in a burst of both triumph and tragedy. As a child, Jane occupied a paradoxical space. Her parents' social rank placed them among the country gentry rather than the elite nobility, so opportunities for refined education were limited. The Seymours were not so poor as to ignore their children's futures, nor were they wealthy enough to provide the kind of lavish, well-rounded schooling that might have been available to high-ranking aristocrats. Jane's father, Sir John Seymour, had earned the king's favor by campaigning in France and showing valor in battle. Jane's mother, Lady Marjorie Wentworth, was a quieter force with notable royal ancestry tracing back to Edward III, a lineage that lent the family a faint glow of prestige. Within this environment, Jane learned obedience and the virtues of a traditional Catholic upbringing, something that would never really leave her. She was taught to read in English, to handle everyday household matters, and to perfect skills that would serve her well as a gentlewoman: horsemanship, needlework, basic etiquette. While not academically inclined in the way that Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn had been, she developed a thorough competence in her domestic world, excelling at tasks like embroidery and household management. In those early years, no significant interest was paid to Jane's intellectual talents. Few expected her to become anything beyond the wife of a landowner, or perhaps a mid-level courtier. The family was large. Sir John and Lady Marjorie had 10 children, and Jane was one of the older surviving ones, a position that demanded she learn the caretaker's role at home. Indeed, by the time she was in her mid-teens, Jane probably spent much of her days helping her mother, instructing her younger sisters in tasks suited for well-bred young women, and refining her own sense of decorum. This unassuming childhood, so distinct from the flamboyant circles of grand nobility, provided the bedrock of Jane's personality. She was calm, self-effacing, and wary of rocking the boat. But beneath that placid surface, she also nurtured a certain ambition, one that would only become visible when she found an opportunity that changed her life forever. That opportunity arrived when Jane was around 19 years old, a point at which some families in Tudor England might have begun to worry about their daughter's marriage prospects. Sir John, ever mindful of creating chances for his children, leveraged his connections and arranged for Jane to join the household of Queen Catherine of Aragon as a lady-in-waiting. It was 1527, and Catherine's world was already beginning to crack at the edges. Jane's immediate goals were modest, perhaps to attract a suitable husband at court, secure a stable future, and bring some measure of prestige to the Seymour family. Courtly life, however, was a swirling pool of rumors, politics, and seduction. And it was inside this world that Jane, so recently a figure of the quiet countryside, found herself on a collision course with destiny. In those first years at court, Jane's fundamental loyalty lay with Catherine of Aragon. She observed from the sidelines as King Henry VIII, desperate for a male heir, embarked on a highly public quest to annul his marriage to Catherine. That quest soon brought a vibrant, captivating figure named Anne Boleyn into the spotlight. Anne was everything Jane was not: intellectually trained, politically savvy, flamboyant in fashion and manner. She actively participated in debates about religion and statecraft, fueling the king's desire for religious reform that would allow him to divorce Catherine. Many of Catherine's household members were appalled at Anne's ascendancy. Jane, for her part, showed no open hostility or strong opinion. She seemed guarded, polite, and unthreatening. It was precisely this discretion that likely allowed her to remain in favor even after Anne supplanted Catherine as queen. By 1533, Anne Boleyn had become the new mistress of the realm. Officially, Catherine was out of the picture, relegated to a smaller household far from court. Yet Henry's ardor for Anne began to wane as the years passed without a surviving son, and so the stage was set for Jane's own improbable rise. Some historians argue that Henry's fascination with Jane Seymour might have flickered to life around 1535, possibly during a royal progress through the countryside, perhaps even near Wolf Hall. Others pinpoint the start of his pursuit to early 1536, when Anne Boleyn, pregnant yet again, seemed to be losing Henry's confidence. Whatever the precise moment of initiation, by January of that pivotal year, rumors were swirling around court that Henry was paying special attention to Jane. The shift was both obvious and ominous. Anne Boleyn, once the unstoppable favorite, had reason to fear that her demure lady-in-waiting was no simple bystander. Court gossip exploded in January 1536 for two reasons. Catherine of Aragon, still beloved by many, died on the 7th of that month, and only a few days later, Henry had a catastrophic jousting accident that left him incapacitated for a time. Many at court interpreted these events as ominous portents. Catherine's death removed a significant obstacle to Henry's remarriage, but ironically, Anne Boleyn's pregnancy ended soon after Catherine's funeral in a heartbreaking miscarriage. Moreover, Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador and devoted supporter of Catherine's daughter Mary, reported that Henry had visibly showered Jane with gifts and attention. It was said that Anne once caught Henry and Jane in a private, compromising moment, with Jane perched on his knee. If that story is true, it reveals the audacious side of Jane's character that might have been quietly brewing behind her outward reticence. From this point on, the tension escalated. Anne, known for her fiery temper and quick intellect, did not suffer rivals calmly. She allegedly slapped Jane in a rage, accusing her of flaunting the king's affections. Jane might have outwardly apologized or acted sorrowful, but she never vacated her position, nor ceased to captivate Henry. Much like Anne had once done, Jane consistently refused to become Henry's mistress outright, refusing letters or tokens from him unless they came with promises of genuine commitment. While the specifics are murky, Some historians believe that Jane had effectively learned from Anne's own playbook. By denying Henry the easy path to a casual affair, she nudged him toward the notion that marriage to her was the only acceptable outcome. The king, well acquainted with the challenges of strong-willed queens, found Jane's gentle, modest image refreshing, though it's questionable whether Jane's nature was indeed so gentle, or if she simply knew how to manage Henry's expectations. Amid the swirling rumors, Henry began to maneuver behind the scenes. Under his authority, investigations ramped up against Anne Boleyn. A suspicious swirl of charges coalesced: treason, adultery, incest. Modern historians generally agree that these accusations were, at best, inflated or, at worst, outright fabrications. But they served Henry's immediate purpose: to rid himself of a queen who no longer satisfied his ambition. As Anne's downfall approached in the spring of 1536, Henry moved Jane to a more private residence at Chelsea, keeping her distant from the furor at court. He was determined to avoid scandal or the impression that Jane was complicit in Anne's demise. Even so, everyone knew that Henry and Jane were forming a serious bond. Jane herself must have realized that the king's plan to remove Anne from the throne was reaching its endgame. When Anne Boleyn was arrested and later brought to trial, Jane stayed away from the public eye. Reports suggest she displayed little reaction, at least not publicly. Perhaps she feared angering the king by showing sympathy for Anne, or perhaps her ambition had overridden any compassion for the woman who had once been her mistress. On May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed by beheading at the Tower of London. Henry wasted no time. The day after Anne's execution, he formally betrothed himself to Jane. Less than 2 weeks later, they married quietly at the Palace of Whitehall. The transformation was breathtaking in its swiftness. Within a month, Jane Seymour had gone from being a lady-in-waiting, overshadowed by drama, to the new Queen of England. For Henry, the marriage to Jane promised a reprieve from the tumult of his first 2 unions. For Jane, the challenge was enormous. She was not from a powerful aristocratic family. She lacked the sophisticated education of her predecessors, and she suddenly found herself at the very center of political and religious tension. Many of those who opposed Henry's religious reforms, particularly the dissolution of the monasteries and his break with Rome, saw Jane as a beacon of hope. She was, after all, devoutly Catholic, raised in a household that had maintained priests and traditional worship well into the 1530s. Perhaps she would coax the king into reversing some of his more radical policies. Even the imperial ambassador Chapuis, always on the lookout for a champion for Catherine's daughter Mary, expressed guarded optimism that Jane might restore Mary's legitimate status. Jane herself seemed to believe in Mary's cause, telling Chapuis that she would treat Mary well and advocating for father and daughter to reconcile. Early in her short queenship, Jane Seymour found herself balancing her genuine sympathy for Princess Mary with the rigid demands of her formidable husband, King Henry VIII. There was a streak of compassion in Jane, nurtured by her conservative Catholic upbringing, that prompted her to ask Henry to treat Mary as his rightful daughter. Mary, after all, had endured a shocking reversal of fortune. Once a beloved princess, she had been declared illegitimate after Henry set aside Catherine of Aragon. Jane, who had served Catherine at court and witnessed the heartbreak the older queen endured, felt it only right to show kindness to the daughter who reminded so many of Catherine's dignity. Yet Henry's will was implacable. He refused to restore Mary to the line of succession or grant her full royal favor unless she publicly acquiesced to his demands, that he was head of the Church of England, that her parents' marriage had never been valid, and that she herself, therefore, was a royal bastard. Any acceptance of Mary without her submitting to these conditions would be tantamount to Henry undermining his own authority and the legitimacy of his current marriage. Jane's voice, earnest though it was, did not penetrate Henry's resolve. She soon discovered the peril of pushing him too far. One hint of interference in weighty policies elicited a stern warning from the king, who subtly reminded her that the last queen to meddle excessively in state affairs, Anne Boleyn, had met a grim fate. It was a chilling rebuff. Jane understood from that moment that while she might hold Henry's affection, it had limits. She recalled that Anne Boleyn, once equally adored, had crossed the boundaries of political influence and paid the ultimate price. Wisely, Jane pulled back from trying to overtly shape Henry's policy regarding Mary, focusing instead on a quieter display of warmth toward the princess. Whenever Mary complied with Henry's demands, even if done reluctantly and at great personal anguish, Jane made sure Mary was received at court with kindness. The young woman found some respite in Jane's discreet sympathy, though the queen dared not champion Mary too loudly or boldly, lest it inflame Henry's suspicion. In contrast, Jane made little effort to bond with the toddler Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. The reasons were partly religious. Jane's Catholic sympathies likely inclined her more toward Mary, and partly political. Henry himself showed scant interest in honoring Anne's memory, so any special attention Jane gave Elizabeth could be seen as a tacit acknowledgement of Anne's legitimacy, which would have been provocative. On top of that, Jane recognized the volatility of the king's wrath. She had no intention of needlessly provoking him by advocating for the child of a disgraced queen. Despite this caution, Jane's private convictions occasionally bled into state matters, most notably concerning the Pilgrimage of Grace. This large-scale rebellion in the north of England emerged as a protest against Henry's religious reforms, including the dissolution of monasteries. Being devoutly Catholic, Jane felt an instinctive empathy for the common folk and clergy who mourned the drastic changes to their spiritual lives. Summoning more boldness than usual, she asked the king to show clemency toward the rebels. His response was alarmingly swift and angry. He admonished her never to meddle in affairs of state and invoked the memory of Anne Boleyn's downfall as a cautionary tale. Terrified, Jane backpedaled, fully aware that she had overstepped a carefully drawn line. Royal observers who had hoped she might reverse the tide of Protestant reform were left disappointed. While Henry remained resolutely in command of both church and realm, Jane concluded that her priority lay in retaining his favor and possibly providing England with a desperately desired male heir. That opportunity materialized in early 1537, when Jane realized she was pregnant. For Henry, this was cause for jubilation. After 2 marriages, first to Catherine of Aragon, then to Anne Boleyn, he still had no surviving legitimate son. To say he cherished Jane at this point would be an understatement. He indulged her with every comfort and precaution the court could offer, summoning the best midwives and physicians in hopes that the child would secure the Tudor line. Jane entered her confinement in September, a standard practice in which the expectant mother withdrew from the public eye and prepared for labor in a secluded, female-centered environment. Still, there was a sense of watchful anxiety. Childbirth in the Tudor era was a perilous undertaking, and neither rank nor wealth could guarantee survival. On October 9th, Jane's labor began. Each passing hour brought new waves of tension through the palace halls, and Henry, who had experienced so many disappointments with past pregnancies, grew frantic with anticipation. Finally, in the early hours of October 12th, Jane bore a living son, Edward. The news flashed across England in a burst of triumph. Church bells tolled in celebration, bonfires lit the night sky, and subjects throughout the realm made merry over the secure future they believed this new prince symbolized. In that moment, Jane had succeeded where Catherine and Anne had tragically fallen short. She had given the king the son he craved. Yet the joys of a new prince were soon overshadowed by foreboding concerns. Jane appeared listless in the days after the birth, though the court was quick to dismiss any fear, hoping she simply needed rest. Her condition deteriorated. Suddenly she was feverish, and Tudor medicine, limited by its era, had few remedies for the postpartum infections that claimed countless women. Some whispered of a possible cesarean section, a hushed rumor that circulated later, though never firmly substantiated. Whether Jane underwent a surgical intervention or simply succumbed to childbed fever, the result was heartbreakingly clear. She was dying. Henry, who had invested so much hope in her, was inconsolable, spending what time he could at her bedside before court etiquette or the grim realities of infection pulled him away. Jane passed away on October 24th, 1537, not yet 30 years old and only 17 months into her tenure as Queen of England. The impact of her death was profound. Henry, who had displayed unyielding resolve with his previous wives, publicly mourned the woman he hailed as his true and only wife. A grand funeral was organized to honor her, culminating in her burial at Windsor's St. George's Chapel. That final resting place would one day become Henry's as well. In a poignant declaration of how he wished to be remembered, he chose to lie beside Jane in death. For centuries, Jane Seymour's legacy remained that of the good queen, the gentle consort who never challenged Henry's authority and who died in giving him the male heir. Historians cast her as mild, subservient, and sweet, the opposite of fiery Anne Boleyn or the devout yet politically engaged Catherine of Aragon. But contemporary scholarship invites a more nuanced view. Perhaps Jane was not entirely meek. Perhaps she recognized that modesty and submission appealed to Henry more than headstrong independence, especially after his tumultuous experiences with Catherine and Anne. She also demonstrated cunning, refusing Henry's courtship until he offered her marriage, echoing Anne's earlier strategic approach. She risked the king's anger in championing Mary, but withdrew as soon as she realized she might cross a dangerous line. Even her final triumph, producing a son, was overshadowed by tragedy. In many ways, that tragedy helped cement her special place in Henry's heart, because she never had the chance to disappoint him. When we examine Jane Seymour's story in its entirety, we see a woman shaped by an unassuming upbringing, an opportunistic court environment, and a precarious balancing act between ambition and self-preservation. Her early life at Wolf Hall taught her to be circumspect and dutiful. Her marriage to Henry, short as it was, reoriented the entire monarchy by delivering the long-sought male heir, Prince Edward. Yet as quickly as she achieved the pinnacle of power, her life collapsed in the face of childbirth complications, concluding with her death only days after Edward's birth. The king's grief, combined with Jane's success in producing an heir, immortalized her as a beloved figure in Tudor lore. Historians still grapple with the question of whether Henry truly loved Jane above all others, or whether her image was idealized because she died before his affections could wane. On top of that, her legacy invites reflection on how a quiet persona can sometimes conceal ambition, strategy, and the capacity to navigate treacherous waters without outward drama. Perhaps the final word on Jane Seymour belongs to the historical puzzle of her personality. Even those who championed her Catholic virtues admitted she could be discreet to a fault. The swirl of controversies around her engagement, her conspicuous acceptance of Henry's gifts, her calm presence during Anne Boleyn's downfall, and her dogged, though largely unsuccessful push to reconcile Mary with the king, all point to a woman who learned how to use silence and deference as tools of influence. Whether her apparent docility was a true reflection of her heart or a carefully constructed persona to negotiate the whim of a volatile monarch is something we may never fully know. But the dual impression of a gracious and demure queen who could also orchestrate her rise in precisely the right moment has kept historians intrigued for centuries. The funeral for Jane was a magnificent affair. Henry commanded that she receive all honors befitting a queen who had borne a legitimate heir. Her body was placed on a hearse draped in black velvet, and a procession of nobles, courtiers, and clergymen followed it to Windsor. Masses were sung for her soul in multiple churches, reflecting the lingering vestiges of Catholic ritual that Henry had not yet entirely eradicated. Even in death, Jane was closely aligned with the spiritual traditions of her youth. Then, in a symbolic gesture that carried enormous weight, Henry declared that he too would be interred beside her when his time came. She was, in his words, the wife who had given him the precious gift of a son, something no other queen had achieved. This final enshrinement of Jane in Henry's memory brings us back to the question of whether she was indeed his favorite. Some historians argue that Henry's devotion to her after death was largely shaped by convenience. Since she had died before any conflict could arise between them, Henry could idealize her memory. Others propose that Jane's temperament genuinely soothed Henry's anxieties, ensuring a gentler relationship that left him with fewer regrets than he had with Catherine or Anne. Perhaps it was a mix of both, complicated by the reality that Henry was a man capable of passionate love that could sour into bitterness if denied or challenged. Jane's death froze their relationship at the height of mutual affection, creating a legacy untainted by the strife that had defined his other marriages. In the generations that followed, the mythology of Jane Seymour continued to evolve. Writers of the 17th and 18th centuries sometimes portrayed her as the perfect Tudor queen, chaste, devout, and helpful in healing the rifts within the royal family. Victorian historians, meanwhile, often contrasted her angelic virtue with the supposed cunning of Anne Boleyn. More modern scholars have questioned these extremes, suggesting that Jane's willingness to step into Anne's shoes so quickly and her ability to negotiate with Henry hinted at a political acumen that belied her meek reputation. She was neither wholly saintly nor a ruthless opportunist. Rather, Jane occupied the middle ground, an individual shaped by the swirling currents of the Tudor court, who tried to maintain a measure of principle while ensuring her own survival and that of her family.